be recorded. It will be recorded, and for those, we will send the recording out for those that request it, as long as they agree to the guidelines that we give them. So again, just to remind everyone, it's going to be recorded. Okay, on that. Okay, our two moderators for the day, open discussion, will be Nadia Brown. Nadia, wave your hand. And Robin Lang. And I'm going to turn it over to them here in a few minutes. But before I do so, Tony, is there anything that you want to say before we get started?
Oh, other than this, I'm real excited about this session tonight, and I got the chance to talk to Kyle back a few weeks ago, and made me more excited about it. I think it's gonna be great, and part of it is Kyle's got a deep background with Seattle schools, including especially in issues like curriculum, and I think he just brings so much to the table. I'm really glad he's come to other sessions, and the only thing about Kyle is he didn't go to Roosevelt, he went to Rainier Beach, but we'll let that go and view that positively, and look forward to it. Thanks for coming, Kyle. Thanks everybody for showing up tonight.
Okay, so Nadia, Robin, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, well, Dr. Kyle, welcome, and everyone else, welcome. We're excited about this evening, and we're looking forward to the presentation on Behind the Rise of Anti-Asian Hate. And I know Dr. Kyle has a lot of rich information for us to take in and practical applications of things that we can do. And so with that, Robin and I, as both moderators, we will be manning the chat. And so if anyone has any questions that they would like to present during the presentation, if you'd like to formulate your question, we will read the question and then ask Dr. Kyle for a response. If the question is unclear, we might call on you, but the raising of the hands, we're going to try to bypass that for this evening, and hopefully we'll be able to capture everything. We'd ask that you continue to unmute, especially when you sign on. And with that, Robin, I'll turn it over to you if you'd like to add anything.
No, I think that about covers it. I know that Dr. Kyle has a pretty full program. He has it split into several sections, and at a pre-meet, we came up with some questions, and we will pelt him with those when the time comes. But Dr. Kinoshita, if you would like to begin, we are ready and eager.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. I, appreciate the introduction. I appreciate being here. I think that part of what I enjoy is that, you've got some folks in class of 71 here, which is great. And your class 71 is much more together than ours. I haven't seen hide nor hair of some of these folks, so it's kind of nice. It's also nice to talk to folks who basically grew up here, and there's so many ways that when you talk, you realize what a small town this was before, just in terms of maybe about, not 6 degrees separation, maybe like 2, in that case. So I'll go ahead and launch in. I've got about 35 minutes worth of presentation, but as Robin and Nadia said, it's pretty informal. I mean, I'll stop. I've got some stops to, answer any questions, but it's pretty loose. So if you've got any questions or comments, feel free. And I think I've got my chat screen up here, so I can also see when something pops up. So anyway, okay. Well, here we go. Let's see here. I gotta fix my PowerPoint. There we go. So who am I? As Tony said, I have a background not only attending Seattle Public Schools my whole school career, also in my last job, it was like coming home. Last 3 years of my career as chief of curriculum instruction. but I've also been an educator around the area in those, districts, throughout 33 years worth of education. And, Western Washington University College of Ethnic Studies, and, said Rainier Beach, as well as board member of the Seattle chapter of Japanese American Citizens League. Just one or two interesting stories just to illustrate the, small degree of separation. I got my degree from College of Ethnic Studies in the 70s, and that was an interesting education experience because of the fact part of the education is that the students who attended that actually had to demonstrate in order to keep the college on the campus. So in 1972, the college was threatened with cuts in their faculty while the other cluster colleges were not. And so the students of color banded together to protest that. And there were 2 days of protest. One day they took over the provost office, and the second day they actually took over the entire administration building for a day, and ended up, at the end of the day, finding out that their demands were being met. So it turns out that there's two folks on the call who were actually there that day. I was in the building, and when I joined this group, I come to find out that Joe was also in the building too. So yeah.
There's one more. Les Young was here too.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that just kind of shows you again, this is a very small town. Lots of commonalities we have. Joe and I also ended up marrying alumni from Rainier Beach too. You see her class of 70. So anyway, jumping into what I want to talk about tonight then, again, I'll talk a little bit about the current situation in brief. But I'll utilize my ethnic studies education to actually talk a little bit about where did this anti-Asian racism actually come from, as well to talk a little bit about the fact that there's an intersection of this story in many times and places in our history with the fact that in many cases Asian Americans are often regarded as the model minority. The minority that's made it. And there are so many myths to that and so many misconceptions that I'll actually talk about. And then I'll end a little bit about talking about the community response, which hopefully can kind of leapfrog into what Rare might consider, doing in support of this. Okay, so I'm going to deal with clarification terms in the first place. In many cases, people kind of oftentimes wonder, Asian and Pacific Islander. And, as far as many places where you actually have to check boxes, it's considered a race. Now, people in Asia would consider it really curious to be lumped together with, for example, Japanese with Filipinos, Chinese with Vietnamese, and as well, South Asians. So why is it that there is this group that we call Asian Pacific Islander? And, many of us know too that there are all sorts of other aspects of diversity. There are things like generational differences, things like when your family actually arrived here in this country, at what period of time. And the fact that, we've experienced various kinds of racialization, and there are different stances of it. Well, the short answer is this. No matter where you came from in Asia, you were pretty much placed in a racial hierarchy. It looked different at different times of history, but it meant that you were often categorized very similarly, and you often had broad commonalities of experience, no matter where you came from in Asia and when you came as well. So it could be that, this latest round of anti-Asian racism, a perfect, example of this racialization, you can be, suffer these attacks no matter what country that you came from, even though they talk about the China virus. There are Japanese, Koreans, Filipinos, South Asians who have been attacked for being Asian. You can have been here 5, 6 generations, but you're still considered a foreigner. You could be attacked whether you achieve privilege or not. You're going to be attacked no matter who you voted for, either. So one of my source books, more recent book, Erica Lee, The Making of Asian America.
Aliases. You don't have a job. Please tell me you realize we've been here before.
Can someone, whoever that is, can you mute your computer?
I think you can mute him, Joe, if you need to.
Because if I didn't know better.
Keep doing ours.
I was running an operation working with a United States senator trying to course correct a presidency gone off the rails.
I want to see whether we can do that so you can hear me.
There you go.
Okay, there you go. Thanks. Interesting. So there was a quote from the book, "The History of Asian Americans is a history of how race works in the United States." It's not the total history. What she meant by this is that you get to follow their story. You get to see the different permutations about how racism and race actually work. So the Asian American story is complex in a unique way. Now, every ethnicity story is complex, but it teaches a lot in terms of multifaceted behavior, how racism and white supremacy actually work. So we're often considered to be a somewhat less visible, ethnicity. So let's take Seattle, city of Seattle. You look at the census. Asian American Pacific Islanders constitute 15% of the population. That's the largest non-white population in Seattle. The next largest are Black and Latinx, about 7% each. At Roosevelt, if you look at the OSPI report card, they constitute about 10% of the population currently. Again, the largest group of color. The only comparable one in comparable size is the 2 or more races, which is always an ambiguous category because you don't know what that constitutes. Latinx students comprise 7% at Roosevelt and Black students 4%. So oftentimes when I say that, people are kind of surprised because of the fact that, in many cases, our experiences are, in some ways kind of, not too obtrusive and silent. Okay, so what's going on? I'll provide you this, PowerPoint so that you can actually have links, to various aspects. We've read the news, we've seen the TV reports. Now, at this point in time, over the last year and a half, there's now 6,600 hate and bias incidents that have been reported, with more occurring to this day. There was various reports this week of various, sorts of behavior and attacks. And some of these articles talk about that this number, even though large, and it's probably somewhat close to, I believe, 3 times the normal reporting, could be the tip of the iceberg. There are articles there how cultural factors lead to underreporting, and there are also articles there about how various institutions are sometimes somewhat reluctant to classify certain incidents as hate crimes or bias. There's an article there about how the Atlantic killings aren't isolated or random, but a hate incident with the 6 women being shot being a part of a long history of objectifying, ultimately demeaning Asian women, that the individual committed this crime had internalized. And finally, there are articles there about how it's not about trying to be more American. As I said, you can be here for a long, long time and still be targeted as someone who is basically a permanent alien. There's information here and there in some of the sites to bust a myth. A lot of the viral videos that occurred of Asians being attacked, oftentimes are kind of sensationalized in that they show other people of color attacking Asian Americans. Now, statistics on perpetrators are a little difficult because they're not always collected centrally, but where it exists, it shows that the majority that of white people are the ones that are behind the attacks, even though there are a certain percentage of people of color who are actually, doing the thing. The other aspect, I gave an article a little bit, something else that's going on that's troubling. That here, I have two surveys that, talked about what were kind of the feelings of Asian families, when it came time to talk about return to in-person learning. So on the left, you have a Spring Seattle Times survey, which, in some ways, there are categories that are no surprise. Many more white students welcome a return compared to Black and Latinx students, because in some cases, school isn't working as well for them. But what was surprising was that Asian Americans, supposedly the successful students of color, were just as reluctant as other people of color to return. And if you look at the Lake Washington survey, they had the highest reluctance to return. And, some of the articles and some of the interviews, give a variety of reasons, but the fact that even during remote learning, they experienced cyberbullying, and there was a fear that, they would get similar treatment in person, as well as, the health concerns as well, in the case of many Asian families living in multi-generational households. So what you have now, you have a world pandemic and huge economic dislocation, a huge economic crisis that has occurred that affected millions, particularly working people. And this constitutes basically a crisis in society. And here you have Asian Americans conveniently being targeted as scapegoats again. So, we've seen the news. There are lots of politicians who innocently say, I'm just telling the truth about China. I'm not being racist at all. But then come, after these statements, the behaviors that Asian Americans experience. Now, what I am actually here to say is that the rapid emergence of anti-Asian hate during this crisis is actually not a new development. In fact, if you actually look closely at it, it's a continuation of a narrative that is roughly 150 years old. These are basically cartoons that are about that old, that kind of show the attitude, that essentially communicate the idea that Asians, no matter who they are when they came, are permanent undesirables. And that's why it doesn't take too much to incite anti-Asian racism. The ideology never really went away, and it was lurking under the surface. Now, if you see some of the protests against anti-Asian racism, sometimes you'll see a sign saying anti-Asian racism is a virus. And, in a lot of ways, that's not out of line. If you think of these viruses that are latent, like herpes or shingles or HIV, it seems like they disappear for a while. And it seems like anti-Asian racism disappears, but it comes roaring back at sometimes almost predictable times. So this kind of sets the stage for the present. And I'll stop if there are any questions at all. No worries. If not, I can, keep going.
We don't have anything in the chat.
Okay. I'll keep going, but feel free to throw something in. So I want to expand a little bit on this idea that the narrative that we see to where, if you're attacked on the street, most often the verbiage are two basic themes. One, you're Asian, you're responsible for the pandemic. And two, you should go back to where you came from. And that communicates, obviously, some ideas about the narrative. Now, let's talk a little bit about this narrative and the source. and how it illustrates the Asian American Pacific Islanders' place in society. A lot of that story is illustrated by my own family history, and the experiences that we have. So that's my grandfather, Ichi Tanaka. His story, like a lot of Japanese American, other Asian immigrants. I looked up on Ancestry.com, and the immigration document says that he came here in 1905 to work on the railroad from Nagano in Japan, which is up the mountains. Now, he came here at a time where there's already a pretty well-established political narrative that Asians don't belong. Most of it at first was, of course, directed at the Chinese. So like a lot of Asian immigrants who who came to this country for opportunity and they wanted to escape overworking exploited pay, they ended up opening up a little dry cleaning business by Greenlight. Now you might ask, wait a minute, there are racist real estate covenants. How did you end up there? Well, it turns out that Green Lake at that time was out of town. It was out of the city limits. So they didn't have the covenants right there. Where I'm told it was, of course, it's long gone. If you know where the wading pool is on Green Lake, I'm told that if you go there and look across the street, that's where it was. So in any case, 1905, he sent for my grandmother to come join him in 1907. And the family story goes that by that time, immigration for Asians was so tough and so complicated, she ended up leaving their firstborn son in Japan with relatives. That turned out to be a permanent and not so happy separation. I never met him as a result of that. And, it kind of struck me that this whole thing that we talk about family separation as a result of immigration policy, not a new thing. That occurred at that time. Now, my grandparents aimed at settling here. They weren't necessarily like those folks who figured they'd come here, earn money, and go back to Japan. They actually wanted to make a life here. But at that time, most people know that they couldn't naturalize to American citizenship. The US Supreme Court in 1922 reaffirmed the Constitution provision that only white Europeans were allowed to naturalize for citizenship. So they made a life here, and they grew up here. And that wasn't my mom, who was born a year after that Supreme Court decision, which kind of defined her reality. So my mom, American-born citizen, as you can kind of see, all-American girl, graduated in 1941 from Lincoln High. And, the story that she tells was that, she was thinking about college, getting a degree, pursuing the American dream. She had a pretty impressive high school resume and was told a couple of years later that, wow, that was pretty good. You could have gotten maybe into Smith or Vassar with that. But she just wanted to see whether she could get into UW. That's all she wanted to do. And the problem was, of course, my grandparents didn't have a lot of money, it being Depression, and there were two other kids. So she had an idea. What about if she went to secretary school, got some secretary skills, and got a job and earned money that way? So she went to talk to her high school counselor about that idea, who basically set her straight. He said that basically you could do that, but there's going to be nobody going to hire a Japanese girl to do secretary work. So that kind of illustrates the reality that Asian Americans faced prior to World War II. They're pretty much just another despised brown people, and the white people of color binary was very clear. As I said, they came for cheap, exploitable labor, but basically it wasn't any intention that they were meant to say. So as soon as the labor requirements were met, the door was slammed on them, and there were structures created to keep them in their place. So a lot of folks know there were a spate of anti-Asian laws, such as here in Washington, wasn't even rescinded until 1965, that were passed outlawing Asian nationals from owning land or marrying outside of their race. You could go to college and graduate, they would let you in, but you had a lot of Japanese American Nisei, second generation with law degrees, who were selling vegetables at Pike Place Market. And, you know, the stories goes that there are a lot of establishments here in Seattle that would not let Asians in, much less any other people of color. So again, that was their status: permanent, undesirable Asians, aliens, excuse me, and it'd be just fine as they went back to where they came from. The mythology was they carried disease, took jobs, and were generally a threat. The fact that their majority were soon American-born children, like my mom, really didn't matter. So Asian immigration was effectively ended for Chinese in 1882, 1924 for Japanese, Koreans, and Indians, and 1934 for Filipinos. So this constituted the first wave of immigration, who before the war was segregated from white society and opportunity. And most people know my mom's obstacle to get in the UW ended up being a moot point because, you know, a year later, she found herself incarcerated. Basically, her college dreams were blown up with bombs at Pearl Harbor. Now, she became a success later on in life. Just wasn't exactly the way that she expected. So what you see here is that this is the poster, the Seattle poster, that went up on telephone poles. And you can actually even see, if you look at the fine print, that, you know, Roosevelt Way was mentioned, because I think that was one of the Seattle city limits. And, you know, kind of designated anywhere where Japanese Americans left. They were to show up 7 days later at Union Station with basically 2 suitcases that you could carry. Everything that you owned had to be in there. So as a result, you know, my grandparents lost their dry cleaning business. You know, it was just like a lot of other folks. It was sold, stuff was sold for 10 cents on the dollar. This is a picture of Bailey Gapchert in March of 1942. You can see the empty desks where Japanese American kids were. And I read a letter one time from this elderly gentleman when I was in Seattle Public Schools. He was an alumni of Garfield, and he wrote a letter describing his experience around that time. He remembers one day during school in 1942, came on the PA that all Japanese American students at school needed to come to the office with all their school belongings. So we went over the window and saw that there were 2 kind of olive drab buses parked on Jefferson Street. And he said they were never seen again after that. So that was a reality prior to World War II. So a lot of us are familiar with that story, but there's a twist to the current day political discourse that reflects another reality that occurred in the 70 years after that. About a month ago, Republican lawmakers were talking at a congressional hearing on anti-Asian violence. And he said that basically they're making statements to say that the fact that Asians were now a model minority clearly shows that there's no such thing as systemic racism. So what happened in those decades following? This is kind of a little known story. Why was it today that I could become an administrator in Seattle Public Schools when prior to the war, I probably wouldn't have been able to even to be a custodian? We have a Chinese American governor. So the myth was that we just buckled down after the war, proved our loyalty, worked really hard, tried as much as we could to be like white people, and essentially, the story goes, caused white supremacy to relent because we were so worthy. Now, this was not quite true because we were striving and hardworking before. So what was it that caused the racial barriers to be relaxed for some Asians? So the basic lesson here is that a huge factor how Asian Americans are treated in this country, no matter when in history, has to do with geopolitics as well as economics. If you pay attention to those two things, you can gauge how Asian Americans are going to be treated. So around the time of World War II, basically, if you look at the geopolitics then, China was an ally of the US, and they were the good Asians, as opposed to the evil Japanese, whose immigrants were suggested to racist incarceration. So what happened then, for example, in 1943, Magnuson, and I believe that was our senator, Warren Magnuson, had a bill that passed that repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act. There was also the War Brides Act that admitted Asian brides of U.S. servicemen as well. And even though immigration from that time for several decades was greatly restricted, basically that law wasn't on the books anymore. Now, what happened after the war, of course, we know that as the Allies neared victory over Germany, Japan, and Italy, the Axis powers, it was pretty clear the new world order was going to be between the Soviet Union and the European and Asian countries that were under their influence on one hand, and the coalition of powers led by the US on the other. So after the war, Japan, of course, was defeated and became an ally of the US-led powers. So in 1952, the McCarran-Walter Act was passed, and the main reason for that act had to do with immigration. It was just to make sure that no communists could actually infiltrate and come into the country. But it recognized the fact that there was now an alliance, and for the first time, it allowed that Japanese immigrants and Chinese, as long as they didn't support Red China, they could apply for naturalization for the first time. And at that time, employment barriers began to fall for Japanese and Chinese. Now, the interesting thing to remember, though, at this time, in the 1950s and 1960s, Asian Americans, mainly Japanese and Chinese, with some Filipino families, they only numbered a fraction of 1%, about 1/3 of 1% of the American population. Now, to allow a relatively small non-white group to cross the color line did very little to change the core racial stratification that oppressed Blacks and Latinx peoples and kept them in a subjugated state. And if you read Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, in the later chapters, he talks about the fact that at that time, the US was trying to look good because the Soviet propaganda was that the United States treated people from Asia, Africa, and Latin America as second-class citizens. And this was not helping them in terms of their foreign policy. So after the war, there are lots of entreaties to actually change that. So the basic idea is that we didn't change as Asian Americans, but the narrative of racism did. It kind of showed that when convenient, anti-Asian racism recedes. So Asian Americans benefit from the fact that not only did the US want to actually look a little bit better on the world stage, the next 2 decades of the civil rights movement, abolishing segregation, also benefited Asian Americans as well. So now you have also the modern day immigration policy that had a big shift that changed the reality of Asian Americans from that time in the 1960s. It not only helped, again, the appearance that the United States was less racist, it also helped push the model minority narrative. And kind of worked like this. In 1965, the Hart-Celler Act changed Asian immigration and greatly liberalized it. But there were 2 provisions on there. One was to allow family unification, that is, unification of families that were already settled here. And 2, that it favored professional status. So instead of the old immigration, where it was the poorest laborers that came in, there was a lot of favor to those Asian immigrants who could actually play a role in supporting the economy. So what you have, for example, high-tech engineers, scientists, medical folks being sort of favored for immigration. And so they come in by the millions. Now, at the same time, there's another side to Asian immigration that didn't necessarily result in privilege and advantage. So Filipino immigration, for example, meant that millions of Filipinos came, but they ended up working in fields, though they were educated below certification. This is really common in the healthcare industry, where you have doctors and nurses who are certified in the Philippines, but they end up being put in lower classifications, earning a lot less pay. And of course, then you have 3 million immigrants fleeing the war in Southeast Asia. So the bottom line is this: whereas Asian Americans were 0.3 of 1% in the 1960s, they're now 7% of the American population today, which is obviously a huge change. And they, according to the census, have the fastest rate of growth of any of the ethnic groups immigrating. So essentially, it's kind of interesting that you have families probably like Robin and mine who came before the war, but then you have a much larger number of Asians who you might see out there in society who families came since that time. So one of my stories recently is that in Shoreline, because of the anti-Asian violence, they wanted to convene Asian American Affinity Group, the Shoreline School District Asian American staff. So 18 folks showed up. And of the 18 folks of Asian American background, I was the only one who family came prior to that war. Everyone else came either as possibly an adoptee, the parent was a war bride, or most likely after 1965. So this is kind of what the profile of Asian America today. And it kind of boggled my mind when I thought it's almost approaching 8%. So that means 1 in 12 people in the United States today is an Asian American. So stop here. Don't see anything in the chat. I guess I'll keep going.
And you might be able to see it better.
I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Never mind.
Before you move on, I was just wondering,
I thought that was you.
was there any kind of community support or organized response to Asian hate right after the war, right after World War II?
Or like even before? Actually, that's a really complicated story. In fact, if you talk about, for example, the incarceration, and I think you were talking about that prior to this time, there was actually a fair amount of conflict in terms of how one would respond. What we know and most publicized were the ones who decided to show their loyalty by going along, volunteering for both the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, or like my dad, Military Intelligence Service. But there was a pretty strong strain of folks that actually wanted to resist incarceration. They were, made to kind of check a loyalty form in 1943. And the story is that the questions were so poorly worded. If you checked yes, basically what you were saying, that you forswore allegiance to the Emperor of Japan, that you would serve the military in any capacity. Some folks looked at that and said, well, I never supported Japan in the first place. You're trying to say that I was, or that I would agree to be, possibly serve as cannon fodder. So a lot of these folks actually vocally resisted, and they were gathered up and rounded up from all the other internment camps and shipped off to Tule Lake in California. And the JACL has a bit of a checkered history in that they urged full cooperation with incarceration. A lot of people resented the JACL for that, you know, and that division exists almost to this day. On the JACL National Convention 2019, there was a resolution, you know, that was put on the floor to say that the Japanese American community needed to heal these wounds. It was still controversial. And, you know, half the people, you know, who were there weren't even alive at that time. As far as the anti-Chinese immigration, I don't know of any, you know, sort of political response to that. The only one that I know is basically business and labor leaders are pretty hot to, you know, expel the Chinese, and so that kind of ruled airwaves. I'll go into a little bit later about what happened after the war and succeeding generations in terms of response to anti-Asian racism. That's a good question.
We do have a question from Tim, and he's asking, was there tension between the original immigrants and the new immigrants? And I think he's talking about before and after World War II.
Yeah, I can't think of too many situations where there wasn't some kind of tension. You know, and I think that prior to the war, I don't know, in the Japanese American community, immigration followed kind of the pattern. First, it was the Issei, their one generation, because the 1924 law cut off immigration. That pretty much defined the generations. I think that today, and I'll get into this in a second, there are some political tensions between some of the folks who have been here, like, for example, our families who experienced racialization, and some of the newer immigrants who have, you know, most recently come. I'll talk about that. Let's see. Before the liberalization of laws, well, constitutional rights of the children of Asian couples pretty much ostensibly had all the rights of American citizens. They could vote, they could own property. In fact, the story goes that a lot of Nisei, the second generation, a lot of Japanese Issei farmers would put their farms in the name of their children, who in many cases could be like 5 years old. But since they're American citizens, they could legally own land. You know, obviously, the one place and the most blatant place where the constitutional rights were violated was incarceration, where in no case, if you talk about the 14th Amendment in the First Amendment, that was completely violated. So hopefully that answered that question a little bit. Okay. I'll go ahead and jump ahead because I'll talk a little bit about kind of both these things. And that has to do with a little bit more about the model minority. There was kind of a negative side to the model minority, a side that, you know, was really complicated in the sense that in addition to the fact that, you know, the American institutions sort of showed that they were less racist. In many cases, it was used by a variety of pundits to actually scold the civil rights movement and the fact that, you know, Blacks were actually protesting to improve their condition. And so, for example, you had articles appear in the New York Times about how the Japanese Americans made it by just their hard work. And this was U.S. News World Report that, you know, basically said that, you know, basically you didn't see Asian Americans accessing welfare. So this was a kind of insidious narrative that was also developed, and there were some in the Asian community that bought into it. In many cases, the most recent example of this is actually, as I said, a conflict between some of the most recent immigrants and the ones who have been here have actually seen the racialization. So there's a political trend where you have conservative, politically, pretty highly privileged, mostly new Chinese immigrants who have kind of coalesced around a political trend to get mobilized around affirmative action for Black and Latinx, particularly in terms of college admission as well as employment. So folks may have read there was a case in Harvard in which Asian Americans were protesting discrimination, but what they actually meant was the fact that affirmative action, according to them, would mean less slots for them. And so they joined in a court case to try and defeat affirmative action at Harvard. And this was their protest. This other picture is the Washington State so-called Asians for Equality, who mobilized in 2019 to defeat the affirmative action initiative that was on the ballot. And they were, again, mostly new immigrant Chinese professionals who were based on the East Side. Interesting subtext was that they're so strident that the Washington State Proud Boys came out to support their ballot initiative, just to kind of show exactly where they landed. And, this is a noisy minority that actually gives impression that Asian Americans want to protect their model minority status, when in fact, they have done polls that show that 74% of Asian Americans actually support affirmative action for Black and brown peoples. So these folks are definitely in the minority. However, they kind of show up, as being really visible. So that's one part of the model minority, but part of the reason why it's a myth is the fact that it is not true necessarily that, if you're Asian American, that you've made it. What is true, for example, if you look at median income, as an aggregate, Asian Americans seem to be higher than any other ethnic group. But it kind of hides the fact that Asian Americans are an incredibly diverse group. In fact, the Pew Research Center said of any ethnic group, they are the most polarized between the haves and the have-nots of any ethnic group. So here, for example, in Los Angeles, you see that, yeah, there's some pretty affluent Chinese, Indian, Japanese, at the same time, some pretty poor Korean, Japanese, and Filipino families. And here, the Chinese population that live in poverty, you can see that the poverty rates kind of compare with those in society. And you can go to cities like the Bay Area, where Asians have nearly the highest rate of poverty in that urban area. So it's kind of a myth that all Asians have made it. If you have engineers and tech workers and doctors at the same time, you have garment workers, restaurant workers, custodial and struggling impoverished small business owners, such as the ones who were the victim of the racist hate crime in Atlanta. So basically, you have this kind of duality going on that makes the model minority basically a myth. The second part of the model minority myth is that scapegoating is, something that exists in the past. Well, we, know that that's not true, but you can see it's a predictable pattern. You have a crisis, and then, you do a broad campaign denigrating or blaming the target, for that crisis, followed by instances of violence. So in the 1880s, the American economy in general suffered a downturn, and business and labor leaders launched a campaign blaming Chinese workers for taking American jobs. So locally, a lot of us are familiar with the fact that you had anti-Chinese riots in Seattle, Tacoma, and Bellingham, and you had lynchings of Chinese workers in South King County. And they, of course, were shipped off, to San Francisco. And of course, you had a lot of the hysteria, war hysteria in the early part of World War II. And it's not confined to, the time of, prior to World War II. And I said, geopolitics and the economy, that is what kind of determines how Asian Americans were regarded. So a lot of us are old enough to remember 1980s. The U.S. In the early 80s entered recession that featured Japan overtaking the U.S. economy, less expensive and higher quality cars and electronics. In American polls, Japan replaced the Soviet Union as the biggest threat to America. And as a result, if you look at hate crime statistics for that decade, Asians were at the top then. Folks are sometimes familiar with the case of Vincent Chin, who in 1982 was beaten to death with a baseball bat by two auto workers in the Midwest who thought he looked Japanese. He had just come from his bachelor party and about to get married. Ronald Evans and Michael Nitz, the two men, were found guilty, and their sentence was a $3,000 fine and 3 years probation. That was it. And it was a pretty clear statement on the worth of Vincent Chin's life. And the judge reportedly said at sentencing that it would be a shame to ruin these two men's lives as a result of this incident. Kind of like the guy in Atlanta who said that the shooter in Atlanta was kind of having a bad day. So there's a question, I think, Naja, about the high suicide rates in the Asian population as it relates to the model minority. Yes, that is very true. And that is the side of the model minority myth, which says that even if you have experienced some privilege, it doesn't, basically exempt you from the pressure to actually fulfill that role. And lots of familiar stories, like, for example, there's the woman who is actually a college professor, the Tiger Mom, who prided herself about how hard she came down on her two daughters. And so a lot of it has to do with the fact that you have really high expectations from society. And at the same time, if you have immigrant parents who are, really striving to try and make better their life, you have a lot of Asian kids caught in the middle. So anyway, just to continue, but I want to talk about the fact that there's another side to this model minority. And that is the fact that a pretty big feature of our existence here, particularly those folks who have experienced racialization, is that there's a lot of rejection of playing that model minority role. And that's a part of our history as well. So for example, my parents' generation, basically at the same time that the model minority narrative was, coming down pretty hot and heavy, the rawness of the racism that Issa and Issa had experienced only 20 years prior was very strong. So this lived experience coalesced when the civil rights movement began to rise, and it started producing members of the community with the wisdom and courage to start bucking the tide of model minority current, which basically said that you had to be quiet and not say anything about racism. So here, if you go to the website gensho.org, which is an oral history site dedicated to preserving the accounts of a lot of Nisei who have since passed on. This was a blog, and there are two of these women that have local connections. The second one to the right, of course, is Aki Kurose. And if you go to that site, you can see her story and see why a middle school in Seattle is now named after her. She not only was an early supporter of the Black civil rights movement in the central area, supporting Congress racial equality early on. She's a peace activist and very active in the fight to attain redress for Japanese Americans. The woman on the far right is named Sharon Kenosha, and yes, she's related. She is credited as being one of the key national leaders in the beginning of the redress that occurred in 1988, which granted an apology as well as $20,000 compensation for surviving internees. She also was responsible for helping to lead redress for City of Seattle, Washington State, and Seattle School District workers who had been summarily fired because of their ethnicity in 1942. So these women all broke out of what was the accepted role of the quiet Nisei women, and they did so against various kinds of intimidating sexism aimed at putting them back in their place. So in any case, you had that generation, and you had my generation as well. Basically that, we were of that generation that we're all familiar with. Here you see them here in Seattle anyways, who took up support of anti-war movements, anti-racist movements for ethnic studies, and in this case, against the gentrification of the Chinatown International District that was initiated because of the locating in the Kingdom. If you look at the picture up on the upper right, and if you look at the lower left, you might find somebody that looks somewhat suspiciously like your presenter. In any case, that happened to be the occupation of King County Executive John Spellman's office, saying that the county needed to do something about the gentrification and the eviction of the poor Asian residents of the CID. So you also have a generation, and it's the Asian American younger generation who is stepping up to actually lead the fight against anti-Asian racism. So I'm getting close to the response of the community. This was a statement of the Japanese American Citizens League, in response to this, and many folks actually, protested. And so I can get into that, but I wanted to take a look at the questions. Yes, Aki knew a lot of folks around Seattle. In fact, she's part of the reason I ended up being a teacher, because she was my mom's friend, and she told me to come visit her classroom at Laurelhurst, and also I think she taught at Stevens Elementary as well. So in any case, her classroom was pretty amazing, and she was pretty amazing as well. She was basically about 4'8", but no one would mess with her, and she was a pretty beloved teacher at Laurelhurst Elementary. So in any case, so
Dr. Kyle, this is Naja. I have a question that I'd like to ask, and it kind of is in the model minority category. So when you think, when I think about the various generations, Japanese American generations, you've got the Issei, Nisei, Sansei, Nihonsei. Whose responsibility is it to educate the younger generations of maybe some of the stories that have been lost in your history, or the stories or the narratives that have been changed?
Well, we have a conversation internally in JACL, which is kind of multi-generational. You have folks who are my age, and you have folks who are 30 and under, and we talk about the fact that it's our collective responsibility. one of the things that we did that I didn't mention here, for example, last year when, you had the great racial reckoning, JCL took it upon itself to launch a series in the community. Basically, the title was Uprooting Anti-Blackness in the Japanese American Community, and we targeted the model minority myth, because if you scratch the model minority myth, you get anti-Blackness. Because if you ask the question, well, what about other, people of color? That's where the anti-Blackness comes about, which they said, well, if they just work hard like us, or if they save their money, or if they behave right like us, we said that we had a responsibility to deal with that and combat that kind of ideology within our community. So we ended up with 6 community presentations. Because of the fact that it was Zoom, it was great because we advertised it nationally in JCL, and we had folks from Los Angeles and Massachusetts, and one person even from Japan who attended. And we had about 100 folks who regularly attended this. But yeah, we double down that it's our responsibility to take this on, and no one else should be the one that has to do the labor but us to really deal with that.
So with that being said, do you support the need for ethnic studies in the schools today? That would include, of course, AAPI and BIPOC history. Do you support that?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. In my 3 years in Seattle, that was one of the areas that I worked the hardest on, was to try to gather up both the teachers and the community members who are in support of this. And so I still work with, some of the activists, who support ethnic studies, and find ways to try and support them even though I'm retired. Yeah. Okay. There's a good question here. What extent was redlining or similar practices used against Asian Americans? Well, that's an interesting story. I think, everyone's familiar with the real estate covenants. Asians were mentioned in all of those, as well as Blacks and, folks of Jewish background and whatnot. I have a map, which I didn't put up here, but I managed to find it in this, if you look down at the very bottom of my screen, the Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project, they found a census map that basically showed where Black families lived in Seattle in 1960. And you can imagine it was mostly the CD. They also had a map showing where Asian families lived. And basically they lived in the same place, with the exception of the fact that you had more Asian families on Beacon Hill, So these real estate covenants existed. I was telling some of the folks, on the pre-call about my family history, about our family after the war started out in North Mount Baker, which is considered, the CD essentially. So my mom, she had aspirations to move out to the suburbs. So we ended up in South Beacon Hill, basically. And, it was kind of one of those 1960s new construction houses. And it turned out that every family in our block was Asian. The block next to us was Asian and Black. So, and that was 1960. So that's pretty much why I think in Seattle, a lot of Asian kids, ended up growing up in CD. So anyway. So let's see. Yes, Aki was badass. Again, 4'8". I don't know too many people that wanted to mess with her. In fact, when she first started supporting Black civil rights in Seattle, some of the conservative folks in our community called her a communist sympathizer. And she basically told them to shove it. And she was going to support them. Critical race theory in Seattle. I would say that I do some consulting work with districts in Eastern Washington because Zoom, I can do it. It's a huge issue there. You have school board meetings, you have school board candidates running, against critical race theory. In Seattle public schools, it is not, and I think it has a lot to do with the existing ethos of, supporting anti-racism. I looked at my voter pamphlet that I got, King County, and there is, out of the school board race, there are 7 people running for Seattle School Board, 2 spots. There is 1 person who says that they want to do something about critical race theory. That's it. But you won't hear that at Seattle School Board meetings, much at all. Not to say that it isn't a huge problem. Most other surrounding districts, you will hear stuff currently at school board meetings. And anyone who's done any reading knows that it's a response basically to last year's racial reckoning, and it aims at making sure that kids don't talk about it in schools. So, yes, Guy Carose, he's class 71 too. He is, I think, the second oldest, or was, excuse me, second oldest son of, Aki. In JCL, I actually work with both Biwa as well as Paul Carose, the youngest son. We're both on the JCL scholarship committee, and so every year we give out scholarships to, some of the folks in the community. Yes, Ruth Ann as well. The Carose family got around for sure, yeah.
So,
And
Dr. Kyle, you have provided us with a lot of excellent information, food for thought, and the history is just exactly what we need to know more about in these times. So we'd like to hear a little bit about the community response, and then we'd like to leave some time for a discussion on how RARE can support, moving forward with eliminating
sure.
the hatred and racism toward Asian AAPI. So if you could give us a little time to be able to discuss that, and then, but we're interested in the community response also in next steps.
Yeah, and again, you'll get this PowerPoint, and you have these links. You have a broad expanse of the community that's taken stands against, anti-Asian hate, and who are doing a variety of things. The second down, King County Coalition Against Hate and Bias, is a coalition of a lot of social service agencies that serve the Asian community, and they've united to help, do outreach to make sure that Asian immigrants who might not be familiar with our legal system get, report on, things that happen and get support. The third bullet down, AP Organizing Coalition Against Hate and Bias, is basically a youth organization. They're basically, college and high school students. And if you see some of the demonstrations that have occurred, places like Hing Park, and this week, apparently there are going to be some roving demonstrations here in the Puget Sound area. They're behind that. Some of the other community organizations that offer support, the ones, third and fourth bullet from the bottom is kind of a national website that, does some suggestions and training in terms of what to do if you encounter, anti-Asian hate incident. And the bottom 2 bullets relate to the history that I shared. Those 2 are, basically places where you can learn more. So I know we talked a little bit about what possibly RARE can do. And, obviously there are lots of things that you can talk about. I think that my own thinking there is that, if you think about a lot of the incidents, they are kind of hard to predict. they come out of the blue. There are many sort of individuals who internalize kind of the, messaging. And what I think the most critical things that folks could do is to do public statements, which basically help raise awareness of this. And the second thing is something that you've already talked about, which is to really advocate and support the development of Asian API studies as part of an overall ethnic studies program. And the reason why that's important is that Asian American Pacific Islander studies strikes at the very heart of that narrative, that Asian Americans have no history and they're just undesirable immigrants. And that would do a lot. In fact, Illinois, kind of bucking the trend, Illinois just passed a requirement that all students in Illinois be taught Asian American Pacific Islander studies. And we need more things like that. So anyway, that's my presentation, I guess. So I guess I'll hand the floor back over to you folks, unless you have any more questions.
Did you have some direct programs or insights into what the Seattle Public Schools have done recently or can do or are planning to do to address racial equity?
Well, I do know that a couple things. One is that, after a number of fits and starts, they're attempting to get ethnic studies back on track. That's one thing. I think the other thing, Dr. Jones came and talked a little bit about the fact that they're, attempting to develop their anti-racist policy as well as work in, targeting African-American achievement, particularly African-American male achievement. And they've been pretty receptive and supportive of Asian students. A lot of information gone out to reporting and, I think, basically making themselves accessible, just in terms of any support that they can give. So anyway. But I do need to get updated. Things get a little quiet during the summer, and I need to catch up with some of the folks. Oh. Okay, well, let's see. I'll stop sharing, but yes, hopefully you can get this out to folks.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kyle. Your presentation was awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very, very enlightening. I really appreciate your attendance here, and that keep up the good work as far as this critical race theory. It's wreaking havoc. I'm in Virginia Beach, Virginia, so that's why I asked that question. But
yeah,
that's why I'm glad that you're on board there as far as trying to get the situation right. But it's a good job.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I wanted to say it out loud because it's 11 o'clock over here. Tell you people I'm still awake. I paid attention.
Thank you, Alan. There is one question here in the chat from Chrissy Blake. Do we know if there have been any anti-Asian incidences at Roosevelt High School? So I guess that's a question for the floor. Anyone?
Maybe we can find out. It would be useful to know, I think.
Yes.
I'd also like to point out, Alan, that Les doesn't complain nearly as much as you do.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like we talked about during the pre-Zoom session that we had, Dr. Kyle, is that we want to not just have a conversation, but we want to be able to walk away with one or two things that REAR can do to make a difference. Okay, and so Tim's going to say something, I guess, but I wrote down two things you said: a public statement, make a public statement, I guess, in support of Asian Americans, and the other one was development of Asian American studies. And if I didn't write those down right, then let me know. Or if there's a couple other things that you think that RARE could do in this area that would be more impactful, please let us know. And then,
Joe, I had something I was going to say. Dr. Kyle, one of the things that really stands out tonight for me, it's a little bit different than what we focused on, is how American foreign policy or international situation can impact racism or can impact hate. And in some cases it's ironic. I mean, the story you told about your own family, the people from a country don't represent that country's government, regardless of what the situation is. And this happens not only to people of color. I was involved with Russia for many years, and when Russia was our Cold War enemy, Russians were bad. Then for a while they were good, and now they're bad again. And it's happened to Chinese right now again. And it's something I think that RARE's got to track and speak out against as well. We shouldn't be associating behavior of governments with individuals who happen to be from that country. A lot of times they're actually refugees from that country and they oppose that government. So just kind of an angle of your talk that was that I really appreciated.
Kyle, have you heard about the Connections program that we're launching? The idea of bringing together students of different races and ethnicities to do fun activities together as a means of forming, working relationships and friendships that would hopefully last beyond those activities. Have you heard about this idea?
I may have heard about it in passing at one of your sessions, but
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting idea.
So where we're coming from is that we wouldn't be the ones to come up with the activities. We would work with partners who already have youth-oriented programs and ask them if they would be willing to refine and adapt their programs so that the primary focus was encouraging interaction and development of relationships between the kids. And we would help with the financial side of it, coordination, planning, recruiting, and so on. So would like your thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, those are good things. Anything that you can do to foster relationships. I think there are a couple of dimensions on that I think about. One is the one that you talk about that, may sort of bridge kind of ethnic boundaries, which is pretty important for kids to learn how to do. And I think, what I see here on my Zoom screen is pretty clear evidence that, in many cases that occurred at Roosevelt. And I can sort of say that because I don't think, for example, my class, it really happened in the same way that you did. The other dimension, which seems contradictory, but isn't really, is that in many cases, kids also need a place to where they can be with folks that have pretty similar identities and are meeting pretty similar challenges, which is why you see, for example, ethnic student unions nowadays in high schools even. But that's so that basically, they can know their history, know their culture and things like that. And it doesn't necessarily lead to separation in the sense that if you are sure of yourself, if you have a strong identity, then you're much more able to relate to other people and to, share with them. Now, the fact that you have kind of, situation where different ethnicities can kind of relate to each other, then you have the best of both worlds, I think.
Thank you. I'll probably be contacting you for ideas because we're looking near and far for partners and other program ideas.
Yeah, I like to add to that in terms of maybe talking to you more about things that we could do in the future with your knowledge and experience and so forth. Just maintaining this relationship and hopefully making things better for everyone. It's you just touched on this thing about ethnic studies, critical race theory, and all that. It's all about education. Okay, and it seems like there's those that are out there that they're afraid of the truth coming out. Okay, and maybe they're afraid because of their own insecurities or whatever, and they hide behind the fact that they're trying to protect their kids, when in fact they're probably just, like I said, trying to protect their own insecurities and what have you. But I'm even more convinced that this ethnic studies, the knowledge of each other, is so important, for everyone. I got a lot of good information here, things that I didn't know about, and it made a lot of things make sense. And one of the challenges I think we have too is, within each, whether it's the Black race or Asian or whatever, this ideal of privilege versus non-privilege, and where the privileged feel that oh God, I got to cross my thought there late, but that affirmative action is a bad thing, okay, versus the underprivileged within the same race that haven't had the same privileges, advantages, or whatever, needing something like affirmative action to help. And you have one against the other if you allow that to happen. Okay, but anyway, good, excellent presentation, very informative. Give a round of applause, everyone. And and again, thank you for your support. And I think if you're willing, like I was just saying, I think that we would, and Tim mentioned it, but we would really like to talk to you further about some of these initiative ideas that we have and get your thoughts on it, and see what we can do to make them even bigger and better on that. So,
yeah, anything I can do to help.
Okay, I think someone raised their hand, Christy.
Joe, I really like the idea of Rare making a statement about this issue and possibly other issues in the future. And I don't think we actually have a mechanism set up to do that. So I just want to make sure that we make note of that. So we have a discussion about whether we want Rare to be a body that's making public statements in regards to race-related issues. And if so, how we go about doing that and what the criteria for that is. Because I think that's a really good way for us to use our voice. And I personally, I'd like to see us do that, but I don't think we're set up to do that right now.
Okay, good point. Good point. We'll put that on the agenda. Okay. Okay. As Alan said, it's late.
Can I say one thing? Just a note that I think you all should have to realize, and I know Dr. Kyle brought that up, is the fact that for the Filipino community, 70% came, or I would say 70% of the Filipino Americans today are really newly immigrants. I mean, we're like, my father came in the 1920s, for example. Mm-hmm. We are such a small minority, but because of that 1965 Act, a lot of the people feel that, or perceive that I just came off the freaking boat, and I'm pretty sure if Kyle talked to a lot of these Virginians here, they would say, wow, your English is really good. So we have a lot of what do you call it, obstacles still But then I'm very, very fortunate to be raised in Seattle in a very, very ethnic-based, community-based community that, you know, I'm able to train a lot of the students I work with to expect being treated differently. And it's how you react to it. And I'm just so proud of you, Kyle. I mean, you just, wow, you're right on, man.
Great.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, Tony, anything you wanted to add before we close down?
No, just really multi-sided, rich presentation, a lot of stuff for thought. And I really hope, like, second what Joe said, Kyle, if hopefully we can have kind of a partnership with you going forward. I think we can hopefully benefit each other. I know you could benefit Rare a great deal. You already have. So thanks again for a great evening.
Okay. Okay. Hey, everyone, thank you for your participation. I know it's late, but you know, very excellent presentation. Again, Kyle, thanks a lot. We appreciate it. Okay. Have a nice evening, you guys. Who's that? Who's this? Okay.